Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Saturday, February 22nd, and today I am fielding a question from a viewer that was left a few days ago on the post that I made about Jupiter and Neptune. So the question goes like this. As a student growing into classical astrology, I don't understand this video. For one, Neptune doesn't exist. And for another, it's transit action, which has no relation to my natal chart. What am I meant to get from this? So my initial response was like, what are you, crazy? Of course Neptune exists. What are you talking about? To which they then replied to me both privately and in a thread that was developing. And some other people had some strong responses to this as well. And I asked for permission from this individual to use their post as a Q&A video, which they said, go for it. So thank you to Rob out there for letting me use your question. He then wrote and he said, I should clarify, it wasn't written as a complaint. He also apologized for being glib. He said, there is a real point there I am looking for an answer to. When I said Neptune doesn't exist, I meant literally that in classical astrology it doesn't. None of the outer planets do. And I've heard you say in other videos that you encourage your students to remove the outer planets from their readings for clarity and depth, and that everything signified by the outer planets is signified by the inner planets when they are properly read, as in we don't need them. Okay, so let me try to clarify. So yes, I say something like this in some of my videos and to my students, but there's some important clarification that needs to be made here. One is that I don't say to not use the outer planets because they don't exist. I say set them aside for now as you're studying and learning to implement the language of Hellenistic astrology. And the reason for this is that as you're learning all of the really sophisticated, beautiful, rich delineation techniques of ancient astrology, it helps to almost get into the headspace of an ancient astrologer and the way that the chart looked. And it becomes, in my opinion, once there's other symbols in the chart, the mind can't help but be trying to pick up on them. So just as a matter of clearing headspace for yourself when learning ancient astrology, I recommend just sort of taking the outer planets out of the view of your chart. What I like to say also is when I say you'll find that they're not lacking in anything, that they say everything the outer planets could say. I'm saying this not so much in order to say that the outer planets don't exist or aren't important, as I am trying to say that, like for example, when I did this over the course of a couple of years, when first practicing Hellenistic astrology after studying it for a while, I maybe 1,000 readings that I did without the outer planets. And I can tell you right now that there wasn't anything lacking in those readings. I was still able to be very accurate about anything ranging from a person's character or psychology to their past to their future. And so my pushback is not so much, again, it's not so much, oh, outer planets don't exist, we don't need them, blah, blah, blah. It's more that there's also this kind of misconception in modern astrology that the outer planets and the asteroids have made astrology more accurate, more objective, and more complete. They represent a positive, more sophisticated astrology than what we had previously. To that point, I respond by saying, no, that's not true. Just do 1,000 readings in the Hellenistic mode of reading planetary phases, dignities, sect status, benefic and malefic, the ancient meanings of the houses and aspects, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you'll find that it's a different kind of language. It's a different set of tools and symbols, but it is just as rich, just as complete, just as beautiful and deep, archetypal, psychological, soulful, personal, etc. And so that's my pushback, right? But again, that is not to be mistaken with me saying that therefore the outer planets don't exist or they have no purpose or relevance or utility in astrology. That's absurd because I use them every day. And it was always my plan all along to sort of bracket them off for a period of time so that I could deepen my understanding of this ancient language, right? So that's what I mean when I say that. Now, along that path, you also asked, you asked another question, which was, when I talked about Jupiter and Neptune transiting, that it's planet to planet, which has no relation to my natal chart. So what am I meant to get from this? Well, there are two levels at which we are reading astrology. We're reading it in a natal context, which is one classical branch of astrology, where you relate everything happening in the sky back to your birth chart. And then there's also a mundane transit, a mundane branch of astrology, which is to say that we study astrology from the standpoint of looking at big events or movements that are happening in the world, in the collective, in politics, right? So the birth chart is just a freeze frame of the constant cycling of the planets at a particular moment on a particular date and time from a particular place. We're freeze framing that, and that artificially frozen moment in time becomes a divinatory picture of the, seeding or birthing of a soul into a form that has a kind of karmic momentum behind it and has a kind of karmic trajectory ahead of it, right? So that's why we study birth charts. We relate everything in the sky back to that birth chart to get maybe the most accurate personal way of relating the continued movements of the planets, the continued movement of the great karmic river in the sky, back to the initial karmic imprint of your birth chart. So we track transits in relation to the birth chart. However, there is also a level at which knowing the weather in a more general sense, a more karmically general sense, is interesting. For example, if I was a weatherman, I can't get on TV and read how the weather is going to affect every single person on the block, but I can tell you it's going to rain. But the rain is going to affect Jim and his household different than Carol and her household. You know what I mean? So similarly, mundane astrology is telling us what's happening on the whole, like what, and Jupiter-Neptune transit, when I talk about such a thing in a video like that, we're talking about the collective flow of karma. But you're right to think that how that collective movement applies to your individual birth chart is how you will take that general information and apply it more individually. That's just not something that, that I do that in my daily practice with people who I see privately one-on-one. I can't do that in a general video, obviously. So, so there's a mundane general level at which we're just talking about the river of karma in the sky. And then there's a more personal natal level at which we're taking that and relating it back to the birth chart. So that's the answer to that question. Now, you also said, on the other side, we have modern astrology, where there are any number of asteroids, fixed stars, minor gods and goddesses, in addition to the outer planets, in a system which can be used to create any meaning anyone wants. Because there is no fate and it's all psychological. Want to feel better about something? You can surely find a way to read it in your chart. This is the false astrology I've heard you say before, and I agree with you about it. Okay, so for another point that needs clarifying, and I'm happy to clarify this because I really don't want people hearing the things that I say. You have to remember, like, I'm a preacher's kid, right? So sometimes I make really sort of emphatic points, but they are the points that I'm often making in response to something else, right? So when I say that, we don't want a million asteroids, minor gods, goddesses, etc., in addition to the outer planets, because then anyone can kind of create any kind of meaning that they want. It's all psychological. There's no fate. You can feel better about anything because you can just make the symbols say whatever you want, etc. What I'm responding to, again, is not something that is categorical about modern astrology. Modern astrology is as diverse as the different astrologers practicing it, and there's a lot of people that are interested, that are students that get readings, who are readers, etc. I'm talking about trends, right? So when I say, for example, that one of the reasons that ancient astrology can help you to become a better astrologer is that one of the things that I was faced with as a student of modern astrology was what I like to call a flooded oracle, which is when if you've ever asked the oracle a question too many times, you ever flip too many cards, right? You know what I mean? Suddenly you're lost in a sea of symbols, and you feel as though you've somehow flooded the tarot deck, right? You're like, oh, I'm just going to flip a card and see what it says. And you're like, not sure I like that card. Let me flip another one. Let me flip another one. So sometimes there's a similar tendency. And then what happens in that example, sorry to complete it, eventually you come away being like, not really sure what that meant, too many contradictory images and symbols. So we just kind of throw our hands up and we sometimes will just pick a favorable meaning. This is a perennial thing that people who are learning to read any kind of divinatory device, whether it's cards or, runes or the I Ching or astrology, do. It's just human. Like, we just do this. So what I'm saying is that, one of the things that can be problematic about having too many symbols in the chart is that it's like flipping too many cards, that you can start flooding the oracle, and then it's harder to come away with a concise meaning. Symbols start contradicting each other, and in order to synthesize them, we arrive at cliches that we can feel good about. And I don't think that's astrology or divination at its best, whether you're using tarot or, I don't think a 30 card spread is a very good idea. That's just me. So I'm an economy of craft guy when it comes to tarot or astrology, and what I like about ancient astrology is that you're using a smaller set of symbols in more concise and repeated ways, consistent ways. I think that helps us to avoid that flooding of the oracle with way too many asteroids and outer planets and symbols that end us with a mishmash. However, let me just add to that I will say that, again, I'm not saying that because I think that asteroids and outer planets have no meaning. I have teachers come out to my programs and teach on the asteroids regularly. Some of my favorite teachers, like Demetra George, I got a reading from her that was just brilliant, that included the goddess asteroids in my own birth chart. Like I said, I use the outer planets every day in my practice. So what I'm responding to, again, tends to be the modern dogma that more stuff equals better, which I do think stereotypically just sort of devolves into saying whatever we want to say about the chart, whatever feels the best. And I'm saying that that's a problem that I think studying ancient astrology and limiting your scope down to fewer symbols and more consistent methods can really help you. It's a bad habit that it can help you to break. But just because it helps you break that bad habit, doesn't mean that you couldn't break that bad habit in another way. It doesn't mean that you couldn't break that bad habit while saying, I'm going to commit to these 3 asteroids that I work with. It doesn't mean that you couldn't break the bad habit by saying, I'm going to specialize in Neptune or something like that. I'm for economy of craft, and ultimately that is not about the outer planets or asteroids per se. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, I'm just pushing back on also the modern dogma that I believe exists, which is that more planets means better astrology, which I think is rubbish. That's just my opinion on it. So take it or leave it, So hopefully that answers your question on that point. We don't want to, because look, you can have good or bad astrology using more or less symbols. It's still, at the end of the day, some people are going to be more talented at weaving more symbols together in ways that are still concise and specific. We're concise and specific people. Think about it. If you watch TV and you're willing to sit and commit to 30 hours worth of some TV series, why? Why are you able to commit to watching 30 hours of a TV series? It's because you're interested in the specificity of the characters and their developments, right? If you were watching a show that was nothing more than a bunch of predictable cliches, you would get bored right away. So what captivates us for 30 hours of viewing? It's specificity, it's novelty, it's things that are unique. I believe that studying ancient astrology for many people helps us to kind of differentiate our palette and become more specific, more novel in the way that we read. Because ancient astrology had so many rules and exceptions to rules with such a concise set of symbols. And I believe that sometimes, again, we can sort of flood the oracle and lose that diversity and that specificity and that novelty by just throwing in way too many symbols at once that a lot of the times end up having sort of generic and cliched meanings. That's what I'm pushing back against. But look, I use Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto every day because they're unique, because and they don't have to be, it doesn't have to be just functional. We don't have to just value something in astrology because of what it does functionally, right? symbols in astrology, whether it's Neptune or it's, you know, the classical language of dignity, the different layers of craft, the different craft maneuvers that we make, ultimately they're also a part of the romantic, imaginative, soulful images, pictures, and voices and music that astrologers are hearing and speaking to a client. And we need that kind of intuitive, artful, fluid use of symbols. And people, one of the things that, you know, I've seen people do I've seen people do that really, really nicely with asteroids and outer planets. Um, Again, it's my experience that when people are learning astrology in the beginning, unless they are naturally, you know, really intellectual, able to memorize and sort of ingest and incorporate a lot of good storytelling ability and specificity, and they can diversify their understanding of a lot of things in modern astrology really quickly, that going to the nuts and bolts of ancient astrology right away and just kind of bracketing off the sea of modern mythos and asteroids and gods and goddesses and new tools and all this stuff, and just kind of, I believe that for a lot of people, just bracketing it off and starting with the nuts and bolts of ancient astrology is really, really helpful because it provides a grounded foundation. So that point I'm making is not meant to belittle anything in modern astrology, even though, you know, there's times where I kind of blow the trumpet because I'm also pushing back against this really intense modern dogma that exists that says, look, more, you know, more symbols means better astrology. That stuff in the past was too, you know, rigid and it's sort of prescriptive and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So I'm pushing back against that. That's the main thing that I hope you take away. And then you ask a bunch more questions about how the outer planets got their meaning. This is something I cover in the second year of my course. That's a long and complicated topic. I can't cover that in this response. So I believe that is it, that I've answered all of your questions. You apologize for being glib. No worries at all. But, you know, I also wanted to make this video because, you know, maybe sometimes I've been glib, you know what I mean? Like maybe sometimes in the way that I've presented things, if someone comes across that if that's what they heard me say, then I'm like, well, they got to check myself then and be like, you know, that's not at all what I was trying to say. So, you know, we have to be careful not to be too glib because, you know, our history and our tradition as astrologers is really rich. And at the end of the day, why are we using these symbols? Whatever symbols you're using, why are we using them? Well, for ancient astrologers, you know, it was to help a person start to see divinity in the midst of their life, in their experiences, to identify and recover the soul from material bondage, and to awaken to the divine nature, the divine Leela of existence. And so, you know, we have a lot of tools at our disposal for doing that. And in my opinion, if the intention is there to do that, and some of the craft distinctions ultimately may not matter as much as we think that they do. That's just my opinion again, so take that or leave that. But I hope that you've enjoyed this response. And for all of you who are wondering what you were going to get when you clicked on a video called "Does Neptune Exist?" or "Do Outer Planets Exist?", that this was entertaining. Okay, well, you all have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you back early next week. Take it easy. Bye.